Hello, welcome to Critical Witness, and my name's Phil. We're going to be talking about Christianity and Bitcoin this evening, which is potentially, a very new topic for Dan and myself to be discussing money in this way. So we're joined by Christian, who's going by a pseudonym tonight, and we'll talk a bit about why that's the case in a moment. But Christian, before we go into why we're not seeing your face and hearing your real name, could you give us a little bit about what you are happy to share about who you are and your background, and then we'll go into a little bit about your reasons for what your anonymity, and then we'll go from there into Bitcoin.
Yeah, good evening, and thanks for having me on. I'll tell you what, though, that countdown actually did get my heart racing a little bit. So.
Yeah, thanks to it was a friend of Dan, a family member for Dan. He put that together for us.
It was my brother-in-law. Yeah.
Did its job.
Talented guy.
Yeah, so I am a Christian, just an ordinary guy. I'm in my sad to say late 20s, married to a very not too long. Married to a really, really good Christian woman. We've been married 5 years. In fact, had our wedding anniversary last weekend.
Nice, congrats.
And thank you, thanks. We've been in West Yorkshire for about 5.5 years for me, and then obviously when we got married, she came and joined me. So part of the church plant there, working hard for the gospel, and we've got our son. We've had a little girl who we lost last year, and yeah, that's me in short.
Nice. So just to satisfy the curiosity of those listening in and watching, what's the sort of your philosophy behind your being anonymous?
Yeah, good question. Mainly it's because I'm pleb, just an ordinary person. And so I don't have a face that I need to put to a name. Don't need any particular recognition in the street. And I suppose part of it is that there's a distinction really between privacy and secrecy. So I'm not secret about really who I am and what I do, but I'm private. So I like to retain the ability to reveal myself selectively. Who knows, at some point in the future, I might, dox myself, might put my face out there and tell everyone who I am, where I live, and everything like that. But there's a prudence part to it as well. So I'm sure we're going to get into kind of a little bit more about where Bitcoin is at the moment, what I think it's going to do in the future, and if it is where I think it is, and if it does do what I think it does, then it certainly makes sense to not be kind of splashing my face everywhere, I think.
Yeah, that sounds interesting. Dan, you unmuted yourself.
Yes, no, I was just saying, just out of interest, what got you interested in Bitcoin, and how long has this interest been developing for?
Yeah, really good question. Thanks for asking it. So I first actually heard about Bitcoin in 2012, when it had been running for like 3 years. Started up in early 2009, and so it was in October 2012 that I started at university, and a newly fangled friend told me about it. And at that point, I don't think anyone really knew what it was at all.
No.
Or certainly didn't kind of realize that it might be where it is now, in terms of spread and then price appreciation as well, which is actually, in my mind, the least interesting thing about it.
Right.
But I just completely ignored him at that point. Didn't buy any, didn't listen to him. To be honest, the technology wasn't sufficiently developed at that point for me, with my technical inability, to even purchase any. Like, I wouldn't have known where to start. So I didn't buy any at that point. And then just had a bit of a running interest, passive interest in what it was doing in the news over the next few years. Probably picked up a little bit more interest in 2017 when the price appreciated quite sharply. At that point, still didn't buy any. And then my first entry into Bitcoin was at the very end of 2020. So Christmas Day, we were sat at home. My little boy had COVID. Yeah, that was really tough actually. And I thought, oh well, I'll just give myself a little Christmas present. And so I went and bought some Bitcoin, and then got learning, and have held it ever since.
So, just in terms of price action, we're talking in Bitcoin in 2012. We're talking what, like, was that single digit still, or was that?
Oh gosh, yeah. Well,
was that double digits by then?
Goodness, I think it was getting up towards double digits, but honestly, that is lost in the sands of time, really. I'd have to go and look.
Yeah, I was just gonna look just to see what we talk about 2012, and then
the FOMO associated with that just must be unbelievable.
I can see Eric saying now he's a millionaire. Definitely not Eric, I'm afraid.
Yeah, not quite with 2012. I was just trying to find it very quickly, just out of curiosity.
It was about $50.
2012. Oh, but Binance wasn't even available then, so I'd have to Google it.
Yeah.
So it was cheap. It was cheap as chips. 2012. Not really.
Oh yeah, definitely. But I spent all my money on beer and kebabs, Phil. So
yeah, well, that sounds about like.
And I'm still paying the price for that. So.
Good uni experience. And then so 2020 though, we're talking about end of 2020. So I was beginning of 2021 when I got started around March.
Yeah.
So not too far off, but end of 2020 was at the end of this. Well, I'm trying to think what kind of price you're talking about.
I'll tell you what it was is I said to myself, I will consider this a legit asset that isn't going to go to zero if it passes $20,000. So it passed $20,000 on like, I don't know, the 22nd of December or something. And I was like, okay, I'll buy some. But as I say, I think the price is actually the least interesting part of it.
And that's what we'll talk about. Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
What's the basis for the assumption that if it goes past $20,000 that it wouldn't go back down to zero?
Completely baseless.
Right.
Completely baseless assumption. But actually, the more I've kind of looked into it, the more I've realised that what we've got is a better money than we currently have in our current system, and a money that is actually more aligned with a biblical anthropology. So it understands people better than the current system does, and it honors God better than the current system does. And so those are the reasons that I'm really like holding it now.
Could we rewind a little bit just for people, because I imagine lots of people, some people listening in now and people who will listen in the future maybe won't even know what we're talking about Bitcoin as a form of cryptocurrency. I wonder if there'll be some value in just describing what cryptocurrency is and what Bitcoin specifically is before we get into perhaps the benefits and maybe theological connotations.
So
go for it.
I think we would do well actually to step even further back than that. So I think what we need to understand is what is money, first of all, and then go from there. So what is money? So I think we would rightly say that money is the highest economic good in a society. That can be a store of value that holds value over time and space, and is fungible, so it can be transferred for other goods and services. So it's got to be kind of widely widely accepted. It's got to be trusted, and it's got to be something that kind of is agreed upon. It has agreed upon value. Okay. Now, I think you can look back into Genesis 2, and you see that in the description of the location of the Garden of Eden, the writer of Genesis, in all of the kind of rivers and lands that they're describing, mentions the land of Havilah, and there's just a throwaway comment there which says, and the gold there is good. Now, gold historically has been the money because it's held value over a long time. It holds value over distance, although it's quite hard to transport. And it's agreed upon. So it's fungible. You can trade it for goats, chickens, aromatic resin, which is also mentioned in that verse. So yeah, it's transferred for other goods and services. So historically, humanity seems to have used gold as its money. That's been the case up until fairly recently, in the last 50 years or so, when we, as a kind of global society, went off the gold standard. And so now the currency that you and I use day to day, whether that's pounds, dollars, euros, yen, whatever currency it might be, isn't backed by gold. And I'm pretty sure that there are a number of people who haven't grasped that. They still think that we are on a gold standard, but it's not the case. The money.
So can you explain what that means? So so when we say it's not backed by the gold standard, what does that mean?
So the gold standard used to be that a country, a nation would have gold in reserve, whether they held it within their own country or in another country's vaults. But that gold was a guarantee that the currency that you used could be translated to some element of gold. You could take it to your central bank and say, I want, £8 of gold, please. And they would promise to give it to you. Now, over time, countries realized that actually it was convenient for them to print more currency, print more paper notes than they had in reserve to cover that debt, that obligation to their citizens. Okay. And so you see that starting around the start of World War I in this country, in kind of 1913, 1914, there's a letter that goes out which says, please stop, for the sake of the war effort, please stop paying your employees in gold. Please take your gold to the post office and we will collect it in. We need to do this to win the war. And then the paper that starts getting issued increases by several times over what the gold would have covered. And all of that is to kind of turbocharge an economy on a war footing, to make sure that you could afford things that you would have to have saved up for otherwise. Because in war, there's a need to do things really quickly. Your time preference is low. So it means that you're more concerned about the things that are close to you in time than far away. And so it's expedient to live on debt when you're fighting. Okay. The issue is that peg of your currency to your amount of gold that you had slipped at that point, but wasn't restored. And then obviously you get World War II. In between that, there's hyperinflation in Weimar Germany. I'm actually reading a book on that at the moment. But essentially, there's a kind of political need to pay off your war debt. There's reparations that are levied, and effectively the Weimar government says, okay, what we're not going to do is pay gold to the other countries because we need to keep that for ourselves. We're going to print and print and print, and we're going to give them the banknotes. And as they do so, the actual value in the economy becomes less, because it's like a fraction. Okay, if you increase the denominator of a fraction, but you keep your numerator the same, so if you go from 1/4 to 1/8, you've doubled the denominator, but the value that you have in your fraction is halved. And so the long-term effect of this ultimately is that anyone who holds their value in a currency that is being inflated, i.e. the supply is getting larger all the time, has their value progressively destroyed over time. So you get up to like the 1970s, the whole world ends up going off the gold standard. The US dollar is designated the world reserve currency, so it's the one that everyone has to use in international trade. And then we see in COVID, there's been $25 trillion worth of debt printed worldwide.
It's massive.
The entire supply of the dollar has been inflated by 40% of its entire supply in the last 18 months. So there are now 40% more dollars than there were a year and a half ago.
Is it something like there was more printed in the last 18 months than, or almost more printed in the last 18 months than there were altogether? Something like that. Yeah. I heard some crazy stat.
It's getting up there. And so the issue that Bitcoin seeks to resolve is one of centralization. So this is where I think it's got this kind of biblical anthropology. Okay, so the creator of Bitcoin, again, pseudonymous, we don't know who it was. I don't think that matters too much, but that might be a discussion for a bit later on. What they do is they say, we understand that central banks, who are not really kind of banks at all, they're panels of politically elected people who decide monetary policy. They are the issue because there are people involved, and people who have high time preference. So they prefer to live for today rather than tomorrow. They prefer to live off debt rather than savings, and effectively prefer to try and create value ex nihilo, out of nothing, by printing currency rather than creating value through work in the real world, which then saddles future generations with debt that they never agreed to take on and are bound to pay off. So it's a form of debt bondage. And oh, by the way, there are ordinary people in a country who have absolutely no say in this at all. So what it says is we're going to get rid of people at the heart of decision making, and we're going to set up code which provides a knowable, finite, and scheduled supply of this currency. People can decide voluntarily whether to partake in this system or not. So that's where Bitcoin comes in. It comes in at the very end of 2008. There's a white paper written. So think global financial crash. The first Bitcoin is mined in January 2009, and it's been running now for 12 years with a 99.998% uptime. So it's a network of computers that's never gone down.
Never gone down, you said?
Never.
So security is obviously a major aspect of it, and it is fascinating that it's never gone down. So there's a couple of things just to clarify on Bitcoin, and the issue is this is such a massive topic, so it's trying to work out which line of thinking to go down. So you're just talking about inflation in terms of, so if we use the word fiat, we're talking about normal money, the money that's decreed by a government.
Yeah, so fiat from let it be, and it's based on trust in a third party, who then has the ability to break that trust.
Cool. And so inflation is just a normal part of everyone's currency, and Bitcoin is not inflationary, or it currently is inflationary, will always be inflationary. What happens with that?
So the Federal Reserve in America put out their latest inflation figures today, and it's come in fairly hot, 7.5% year on year, which means that effectively speaking, the basket of goods that they have decided to measure inflation against, which can be changed at any point, by the way, but the basket of goods they've put together to decide how much more expensive everyday goods have got in the last year has increased by 7.5%. Okay, so if you held $100 this time last year, and you're holding it now, is going to buy $92.50 worth of goods. Okay, it's the same all over. So for us in the UK, it was 5.4% in December. The figures for us are coming out in the next few days. I would suspect it will go up as well. But inflation figures are a backward-looking kind of measure. So it looks back and says, effectively, how much money has each citizen lost? Now, your personal inflation rate will differ depending on your behavior, the amount of money that you spend, where you spend it, etc. But those are the figures that they would admit to. Bitcoin is also inflationary. When we talk about inflation, what we're saying is how many more tokens are going to be added to the system. The issue is that Bitcoin's inflation rate is knowable. So you know exactly how many are being added to the supply at any point in time and at any point in the future. So the way it works is with Bitcoin, there are 21 million coins that are ever going to exist, that will ever come into the Bitcoin economy. And the way they come in is through something called proof of work. So it's not coming out of thin air. It's not coming out by decree. They're not produced with no reference to any underlying value or work done. It comes out when computers use electricity to solve complex mathematical problems and prove that they have reached something called a hash. I'll try and keep it simple. It's essentially a long string of letters and numbers that you need to do calculations for to arrive at. When that has come through and it's matched up with the hash that is to be reached, that's then broadcast to all of the other computers in the network. We call them nodes, and anyone can run one. Anyone in the whole world can set up a little Raspberry Pi, put it on their bedside cabinet, and have that decide whether or not that hash has been reached. Okay. Now, it's a distributed system, which means that there are lots and lots and lots of nodes all around the world. And so if one goes down, all of the rest will still have a copy of that record. And then when you get it back up and running, it can just download the history of what's happened and just keep going. So it's very, very resilient, and it's decentralized, which means that there's no one single point of failure. So again, even if you took out half the nodes on the network, and to do that, you're talking, ridiculous things like an electromagnetic pulse or, nuclear winter.
China banning Bitcoin.
Yeah, even if one very large country decided to ban this network, they couldn't do it because the nodes are worldwide, and so even if you had one node, running, you could reset the whole network. You could restart it. There's a little bit like the Book of Eli. Do you remember that scene at the very end where is it Denzel Washington, isn't it?
It is Denzel, yeah.
He rocks
good movie.
the place and then he starts reciting the Bible. So that's effectively like the last node on the network.
It starts again.
Yeah, you start again.
So I think that's really, really helpful. So you're talking about nodes. We're talking about basically a big mesh of computers all spread out, all
Absolutely
basically verifying the same system, making sure that all the transactions are accurate, and is it checking the same sort of software and monetary policy? All that is it within the code? Is that what the nodes do as well?
All checking that everything's legit. So back in the day, if I wanted to go to market and swap some value for something, I've driven my pigs to market, I've sold them. I go to the man in the booth who's got a ledger and say, I've got 1,000 gold pieces worth of value. I want to buy an amphora of wine. Then he would strike out 10 gold pieces and put it next to the guy who owns the wine stall's record, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a way of doing transactions without having to pass coins between each other.
Yeah.
The issue is, what if he's not honest? What if he wants to skim off a bit for himself, or he's mates with the winekeeper and he actually transfers 100 of my gold pieces to him instead of 10? Or what if there's simply a mistake?
Yeah.
The issue of having a distributed ledger is that everyone can check everyone else's work, and everyone knows exactly where everything is. Not necessarily to whom it belongs, but they know a record of all the transactions that have ever happened. And so it means that if there was a bad actor who wanted to do some fraud, as we know that human beings are,
seems to happen.
likely to, it prevents people from doing that because the network will reject it.
Right. So it's not a select few going, okay, we need to print another run of money. It's all programmed in how much is coming out each year or each 4 years, isn't it? Because it halves every 4 years how much is being minted.
Mm-hmm.
And then you've got all these verifications across the world that are making sure that and that would be why it's not being hacked and not being tricked or knocked out.
Yeah, just to add, this is why I am exclusively Bitcoin, not crypto, because and this is really important. So Bitcoin is the first one. It comes out, is then copied, or kind of other projects might be leveraged bets, if you like, on whether Bitcoin succeeds or fails. But all of the others have a centralized point of failure, or they have people involved in the decisions as to supply, or they have something called a pre-mine, which is a bit of trickery where, for example, you reserve 70% of all the tokens available, you float the remaining 30%, and then you can sell one for £1. And if you've got 1 billion of them, you can then claim your market cap, the market capitalization. So that it is essentially a calculation where you say total number of tokens multiplied by the last price that one of them was sold at gives you the ostensible value of that currency. Okay.
Right.
So if you kept 70% of them, sold one of those 30% at £1, then you can effectively claim that you own 700 million pounds worth of crypto. Okay,
that's where people claim it's a Ponzi scheme and they get rich quick.
Well, that's a real con. That is a real con. But Bitcoin has no pre-mine. Everything is fair. People could have, if they'd known about it and were so inclined, mined dozens and dozens of Bitcoin in 2009, 2010 on effectively a laptop
Yeah.
at that time with the processing power it had. In fact, one of the machines that they use to mine Bitcoin now represents the total power that the entire network had in 2013. So this thing is growing exponentially.
It's more pretty huge
for it.
How easy is it to mine Bitcoin? I mean, let's say like I've got my laptop here. What would it cost me more in electricity than it would than I'd actually benefit from?
So in this country, it would, because our energy price is very high. You wouldn't be able to do it with probably a kind of domestic hardware anymore. Mining is tending now towards an industrial kind of bent. You can solo mine. There are instances of people, striking a block, which essentially is winning that hash race that we've talked about, which gives them the right to add the next set of transactions to the record, the history. And for that work, the work that they do in the real world with the real energy, that's why they get rewarded with the block reward, which I think, as Phil has said, kind of halves over time. So every time half of the total supply is mined, the reward halves. So it actually becomes exponentially more difficult to produce over time, rather than perfectly easy to create more at the press of a button.
So what's the incentive then for people to keep mining it? If it's potentially so costly as energy, and let's be honest, energy costs are likely to increase for the foreseeable. So where's the incentive?
Yeah, a couple of things really. So number one is the block reward, and you can see if you look back through the history, the block reward has increased over time in terms of value, even as the number of Bitcoin has dropped. Okay. Because the exchange rate has increased over time in whatever currency you want to denominate it. So people will still do it because the block reward is a financial incentive for doing so. Secondly, there is also transaction fees that users of Bitcoin pay to have their transactions included in those blocks. And again, they are a financial incentive, but it's also an incentive to secure the network, because this thing is permissionless. You don't have to ask anyone's permission to move your value, like you do with a bank or PayPal or Cash App or whatever means you use to move your money now, because it's permissionless, and because it's borderless, and because it's uncensorable. Those are all reasons why people who use it believe it to be worth mining for, or worth expending that energy on. I suppose the other thing as well is, think about fiat currency now. Think about the value that your pound has as much as it decreases every day. How is that value actually safeguarded? Well, it's safeguarded firstly by the trust that the government has or enjoys from its citizens and from the international community. But the proof of work that is done to maintain that trust tends to be a violent proof of work. So at its bottom, war is an expression of human sin. It's as old as Cain and Abel. But war is also a tool that is used to determine the chain of custody for value in the world, or certainly has been in the past. Okay, so that's why people plunder when they've beaten an enemy in battle, because that gold, those sheep, that man's wife, they're not his anymore because you've bested him in battle. And so what Bitcoin does is it safeguards the value of everyone's money through the expenditure of electricity rather than the blood of the nation's sons. And so in my mind, it's worth every watt.
So just a few questions you've been going. I'll just fire a few that I've been thinking about. So when we talk about inflation, you gave the example of the US 7%. How is that, prima facie worse than, say, when Bitcoin drops 50% at some point? So say you've got all your your money in Bitcoin, you suddenly lost 50%.
That is a fantastic question. I'm really glad you asked that, actually. Fiat currency is, as you say, prima facie stable in the short term, and it's profoundly unstable to the downside long term. Okay, so you can see that in anything you care to put a value on. House prices. I was talking to somebody yesterday who said that their dad bought a house for £800. That for less than a lot of people's mortgage, monthly mortgage payment, bought an entire house. Okay, that does not by necessity mean that house prices have risen. What you can look at it the other way is that the value of the currency has fallen by that much. So over time, even though your £5 in your pocket might be enough to get you a few Mars bars, a few Freddos, and you can be fairly confident of that being the case year on year, decade on decade, that £5 is going to become even more worthless than it is. Bitcoin is the other way around. So it's extremely volatile in the short term, but over the long term, and yes, we've only been running 12 years now. It appreciates multiples upon multiples, and the real interesting thing is that, like any technology that's ever been adopted, there is an S-shaped adoption curve. Now that is essentially because with every new technology, there will always be those who are very, very close to the inventor, or early adopters who can see the value in it and adopt early. There's the large majority, your middle 50% who pile in all at once, and then there's your laggards who come in afterwards. You see that in every technological adoption ever. The horse and cart, the steam train, the car, the radio, television, telegraph, everything, the internet, Facebook, Google, and Bitcoin is simply technology. And so it will follow an S-shaped adoption curve. We're 12 years in to what effectively will be a 50, 60-year process. And so as more demand comes in, and bear in mind the supply is completely fixed, so you can never mine any more than 21 million, and you'll never mine it even faster than you can.
The box.
Then what happens when you have a completely fixed supply and an ever increasing demand? The price goes up.
So what you mentioned something else about fraud, about how you're obviously being decentralized. Then the opportunity for fraud to take place from that from a centralized place is kind of removed. But I mean, isn't fraud still a big issue with Bitcoin and cryptocurrency? Except it might not be at that initial point, but on the exchanges themselves. I mean, it's in the press all the time. We've got billions of dollars of Bitcoin. I think it was recently as a thing with the this terrible rapper or something. It was like,
Yeah.
wasn't it like 3.4 billion
Oh yeah,
Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So, and there are other issues as well about, you know, if I've got, well, that's one issue, is that, yeah, so yeah, you're right that fraud can't happen at that point, but I think it is rife at other points. It just moves to the exchanges or another level, and other things as well. I mean, it's risky as well. I mean, there are other risks as well that aren't present with, and that's not necessarily to, you know, a downside, you know, to, you know, trying to be more careful. But if I've got my money in my bank or money in my wallet, it's very difficult for me to make, unless I sort of leave my wallet on the bus, to lose all my money. But if I'm on an exchange, and, you know, I've read horror stories of people, you know, trying to move over, you know, £500,000, or, you know, or $1 million, whatever, and suddenly they send it to the wrong place, or they don't, they make some, you know, error there, they lose all their money. So there are risks with Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies that aren't present with fiat currency, that I don't think can be easily sort of skirted over, would be my.
I definitely take your point. I absolutely do. Yes, it is true that, for example, in your bank account, your government currently guarantees up to £85,000 if your bank went under, or, you know, somebody, I don't know, just got access to your account and stole money out of it. The interesting thing is that they ensure the nominal value, but they don't ensure the purchasing power. So, you know, you'll have £85,000 back, but that £85,000 won't buy you what it used to 5 years ago. The thing with guarantees like that is, where do you think the money comes from to cover the loss that's been made?
They'll probably just print it. I don't know. I mean, just to say that quickly, just to respond to the point there. I mean, I'm not sure about the 5 years ago. I mean, when you lose the money, you're only expecting the value that it had at that point. You know, if I lose this week's wages, I'm not worried about what it was worth 5 years ago. I'm worried about what it's worth now.
Yeah, I take that. But they do print more. They print it out thinner. And so what it does is it socializes the losses. Everyone suffers due to you know, bad actors or people's own you know, fault. It disincentivizes prudence in financial matters. So part of the reason that the global financial crash happened is that banks were playing fast and loose with customers' deposits, but customers weren't doing their due diligence on where they put their money, because they preferred for that responsibility to just sit with somebody else, sit with a third party, and they didn't have that within their own sphere of kind of influence. So this is what happened really when we as a society went from, for example, keeping your money at home. You know, Jesus tells the parable of the widow who loses one of her coins and goes searching for it. So evidently, you know, people kept coin at home, and that was their primary place that they store value. Bitcoin kind of allows you to get back a little bit towards that. So there's a saying, you know, be your own bank. It sounds a bit grand, but effectively what it means is that you take the private keys, which are the essential means of accessing and moving Bitcoin. You take those private keys to yourself. That has the effect of, you know, moving the custody of the Bitcoin from an exchange, which again is a centralized entity, to you as an individual. And then, yes, it does increase your potential for risk, but at the same time, if it is lost, it's my own fault. So if I gave my private key to somebody, or if I lost my private key, I would have given it away. I would have lost it, and it would be because I didn't do what I needed to do to secure that value.
Right.
Now,
So I get in that case in terms of sort of you're right. It's your responsibility to look after, to take care in those things, especially with larger sums of money, especially. But what about the fraud issue still? Because it still seems, I'm not sure, you might have been going on to that. That still seems like a big issue. I mean, if you're, like you said, if I lose my money in the bank, all right, it might be being printed, but I'm going to get a substantial portion of it back or all of it back. But if I lose my Bitcoin, what happens? I don't get that back. So isn't fraud, in a sense in which it's riskier?
Do you mean fraud is in the sense of like the sort of spam, like if you give it,
someone nicks, say someone hacks my account on an exchange and I lose all my Bitcoin?
Okay, so in that instance, if you've been keeping Bitcoin on an exchange, technically you don't own it. What you've got is an IOU to those private keys. Okay, so when I talk of owning Bitcoin, what I mean is controlling private keys. Because if you've outsourced that to an exchange, effectively it's no different to having your money in a bank. Okay, apart from the fact that they're not covered by FCA guarantees or anything like that. So yes, you are actually exposing yourself to more risk if you leave it on an exchange, because there's a wider attack surface. Hackers are going to be far more interested in going after an exchange because they can get not only the Bitcoin itself, but they can get customers' information, which of course is very valuable for identity theft, identity fraud, and they can go after other people then. If they know, for example, who's transacted with who, and they can, go after it that way. So I would say actually there's more risk of keeping it on an exchange than there is of taking it off. I think when we talk of risk, there is an element of personal responsibility that we've been unaccustomed to, which I think is a good thing to reclaim. When we talk about storing your own value, because that kind of flutters out into other areas of life. At least I've seen in my kind of personal experience. So, for example, I am now much more interested in getting out and going for a walk in the evening, because I hold my value myself. Somehow, psychologically, I now take more personal responsibility for my health and fitness. I'm reading through 50 books this year. I've read through more books so far this year than I have done in the 3 years prior to that, because my time preference is extended. So I'm thinking more about the future, and in fact more about after I die and what this value is going to do in generations to come. And so I'm less concerned now about sitting and watching Netflix each evening, and more about what kind of man am I going to be in 5 years' time? What kind of son am I growing and developing? What kind of a husband am I being to my wife? We've just passed 5 years anniversary. What's it going to be like at 10 years, 15 years, 25 years, 50 years even? And it's not to say that I'm, exclusively living in the future. My mind is now on things that I wouldn't have been able to think about had my money been depreciating all the time, right? Because if I'm concerned about, oh my goodness, when's my next pay rise coming? How many years am I going to have to work before I retire? How am I going to afford the monthly shop? Because my money's getting less and less valuable over time. That pushes me into a survival instinct, pushes me into a very short time preference. And you see that in Weimar Germany. as their currency depreciated, people were running out the hour they got paid in cash to go and spend it because they needed to. But that takes out all ability to think about, plan for the future, which Bitcoin seems to restore. So the really interesting thing is that there's a lot of people on Twitter. You know, it's a place where people tend to gather and share thoughts and have community. But a lot of people who are in Bitcoin on Twitter are saying that they are actually coming to understand that there is more to life than what is immediately before them. There's been a couple of relatively high-profile people, you know, well thought of, few thousand followers, who have said, actually, you know, I used to be an atheist, and this thing got me thinking about when I die. You know, my time horizon has been expanded to the end of my life, and I'm thinking about, you know, is there an eternity? Your time preference gets pushed out, and people seem to be starting to actually think about, you know, eternal matters. There's a couple of guys who I think follow me, actually, who have become Christians because they've, you know, the Lord in his grace has used this to push them out of themselves, out of their immediate concerns, and look at the things that really, really do matter.
I think that's really, really interesting, and I want to get to that in a moment, just to talk about how that might work and how we might utilize that, because I think before we came on, we were talking very briefly that there's so much to learn when thinking about Bitcoin. That I imagine that people who've been listening to the last 50 minutes have been going, "Oh my goodness!" Like I've not thought about money as much ever. I've not talked about it this much ever, and so I started getting into crypto almost by accident. Someone recommended me the Brave browser, which is fairly secure, and it pays you a little bit in its cryptocurrency BAT every month, and you get a little bit. And I used it for a few months, and I had enough to then put into an exchange, and I was playing around with the different cryptocurrencies. You've been talking about Bitcoin exclusively to an extent, and I realize now what that was, but basically what I'm highlighting in that point is that cryptocurrency is huge in terms of like learning, in terms of recognizing that you see this line goes up. Oh, I want to get into that. This line goes up. I want to get into that. Where do I put my money? And in many ways, a lot of the cryptocurrencies that aren't Bitcoin, you are on a low time preference.
Yes, it encourages you to sit at your computer screen and watch the lines go up and down, and be very, very concerned about how you can maximize your return, or, you know, get into something at the right time, get out of it at the right time, and you're trading it constantly. You know, the volatility is there. I would argue that that's not a good use of your time or your value. But putting it in something that you know will appreciate, and you can just leave it. And, you know, if you secure it yourself, it can't get hacked. The only way that it would get lost is through your own fault. And yes, you have to reconcile yourself to that fact. But it means that you can just say, look, you know, I'm going to be a husband and father, and I'm going to do what I need to do to serve the Lord well.
So that is an interesting way to think of money. So in terms of, I guess,
could I?
Yeah, go on, Dan.
Just let me just interject quickly.
Yeah.
So the one thing that's interesting about, you know, just got me thinking now about saying about how it makes you think about the future and the present in a different way, and how things are secure. I'm not saying if someone's got a lot of Bitcoin, they've been saving it their whole life, and then they die and no one knows how to access that. What benefit is that to anyone?
Yeah, again, that's something that is definitely best thought of before the moment comes.
As you're setting it up.
There are ways and means of passing it on. Effectively, this is something that we've never had in the history of the world before, which is that to know certain information is to own something. So if you know your private key, which is, again, just a string of numbers and letters, for convenience's sake, converts down to a list of 12 or 24 words that you can memorize, or store in a secure way. If you know those words, that is your claim to that segment of the pie on the total Bitcoin network, which everyone else recognizes that you own. And so effectively passing it on could be as easy as giving 12 or 24 words to the person or people that you want to pass it on to.
Rather than gold doubloons or whatever, which would be very heavy.
Yeah, exactly. So, it's something that's not a physical asset, which I think can be a bit confusing, but it is tied to the real world value that it takes to produce it because of its energy usage in creation. Okay. So it's superior to fiat money in that sense, because it has a real value, because it cost value to make it. But it's superior to, for example, gold, because you can take it anywhere. There's no cost to holding it. You don't need to pay to secure it. It's unconfiscatable, so nobody can take it off you by force. And it's really good, for example, in nations where somebody needs to leave the country in a hurry, and they're afraid of having their life savings taken off them by a border guard, or someone whose house could be looted at any moment. So there are real practical, like, live world applications for this. You mentioned, Phil, actually you've got a friend going out to Lebanon, possibly. That's a country that's currently undergoing hyperinflation, and that there are easily over 1 billion people in the world who live in those circumstances, and then there's a further 2 or 3 billion who live under authoritarian governments, who would really, really value having a currency like this, where they can not be robbed blind. And so by holding my value in this network, what it's also doing is securing the value of everyone else who's in the network. So in fact, it is a humanitarian effort to make sure that the widow in El Salvador, who has remittances paid to her by her son in America in Bitcoin, has the value of her money kept.
Is that realistic? Because it makes me think. Because I get what you're saying, and I've kind of thought through this before. But is there a sense in which at least Bitcoin, as it has been up to this point, and probably still is presently, is arguably, you could argue that it is, I don't make a classes, elitist in a sense, because and I mean that in the sense that it requires a level of digital literacy that probably people from I say it's making a generalization, but I think rooted in some evidence, is that people in lower social economic settings are going to be far less digitally literate than perhaps someone here in the UK, and it feels like the people benefit from it and have predominantly benefited from so far are arguably, they've benefited from from that digital literacy and other privileges and things that they've benefited from.
Yeah, I think that's really insightful, actually. So, I suppose your question is, does Bitcoin benefit white middle class Oxford educated people who happen to know a bit about computers? I think those are the stories that you will have probably been exposed to. But if I were to say that Vietnam, Nigeria, Iran, El Salvador are all some of the highest users of Bitcoin, that might be surprising. I don't know. But also, we've been talking predominantly about the kind of base layer of Bitcoin, and obviously, trying to take as simple a view on it as possible, because it's technology that most people will never touch. Okay, it's like the internet. We're streaming live to YouTube from a third-party provider, but I'm coming in on a particular browser. It's all using HTTP. We're going through domain names. There's layers below that, and right at the bottom is TTPS kind of stuff that even people who have worked their entire lives as IT bods don't touch. Right. So everything scales in layers, technologically speaking, biologically speaking. Your heart pumps blood to veins and then capillaries. So everything goes in layers. And what we're getting now is, layers being built on top of the kind of core Bitcoin network. So Phil will know of this. If you've got a mobile phone, which about 5 billion people in the world do, including most in economically developing countries, you can download an app onto your phone, which again most people who own a smartphone can do, and you can use Bitcoin. So there's a family out in Rotterdam at the moment who have received Bitcoin from me. I've never met them in person. I've spoken to him once over Zoom. They've received Bitcoin from Phil, and they've never met in person, and I don't think they've ever spoken over Zoom.
Nope. I just thought I'd send them some few sats.
Received, really generous gifts from people literally the other side of the world who I've never met in person, or even spoken to, over Zoom. So I suppose we might actually try and do a demonstration of this, actually. Phil, if you've got a Lightning wallet on your phone,
yeah,
this may or may not work, depending on whether I can scan through the
through the screen.
But Phil, do you want to just bring up a QR code for like 1,000 sats or something?
See if I can do this. It's been a while. Right, receive Lightning, invoice settings, add. Hold on. Hold on. Just got to set it to how many is 1,000 sats? This is the thing that actually took me a little while to figure out. That Bitcoin is divisible by, it's 100 million, isn't it? So 1,000 sats is after. So
it's
that's
4 decimal places of 8. Yeah.
1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. No, that's 100 sats. There we go. 1,000. Okay. So if I do that and go.
So if you hold that up to your screen.
So I've got a QR code. Does that work?
I'm going to try and scan this. Okay, it may or may not work. I hope it does, because it should demonstrate the point fairly well.
Does that work? Is that in focus?
Hold it steady.
Otherwise, I can copy it over to.
Actually,
there we go.
Stick it this way, can you? Oh, yeah, there we go. Scanned. Right, I'm going to pay. Scan. I've paid, and it should come through to you in approximately 5 seconds. And that right, payment sent.
Got it.
Got it.
There we go. 1 BTC.
There we go. 32p.
32p.
Now that the thing about that, what we've just done, is that if I was to send that to Phil on PayPal, 32p is firstly a ridiculous amount to send over PayPal, because the fees get you. But secondly, I'd have to ask permission from PayPal to do it, and it wouldn't actually fully settle and be able to go into Phil's account and him to know that he'd got that value for several days afterwards. Okay, with this, that's settled now, and so that 32p is Phil's forever unless he decides to spend it
or pass it on in the next demo.
That's the real killer use case of it. I think it means that somebody doesn't have to travel to their local Western Union office 3 hours away, risk getting mugged on the way, or in fact coming out of the office, which is the most dangerous thing to do. But they can send a QR code or a string of letters and numbers over the internet and get it paid instantly. It is technology that will change the world. It's going to do to value what the internet did to information.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good example. I think my issue is not with the technology in principle. It's just that, well, two things. I mean, one, at the moment, as I said, there's still this digital literacy gap, and I agree. I know in India, Bitcoin is used a ton there and all over the world as well. However, it would be interesting to, I think, when you look at the demographics of those individuals, you can talk about India, but India's got, it's a place of extremes. As well, and so, as much as I'd like to imagine, the poor, single mom in El Salvador receiving Bitcoin from her son in the US, I can't help but think that that's
idealistic.
Yeah, I mean,
I think that's shifting.
But I don't know what. I mean, it's education, isn't it? I mean, is this something that needs to be taught? I mean, but I can see why there's incentives from governments and things not to do that. So it belies, who does that fall on?
Unless you're El Salvador, where your president is buying up Bitcoin like no one else.
He did some good business recently, didn't he?
He's done well.
Yeah, for sure. So I suppose three quick points to that. Yes, to take your point about India being a country of extremes. In fact, the guy who first told me about Bitcoin was from India. Number two, the interesting thing about El Salvador is that this is a president who, without getting too political, it probably isn't the greatest friend of liberal democracy. But the ironic thing is that he's now bringing his country onto a monetary standard, which ultimately will put him out of a job, because it's something that can't be, influenced by central bodies. And then thirdly, you mentioned
he's less busy. He might still have things to do. But...
exactly. Or he can be concerned less about, for example, making sure that money's going to the right place, because it's a ledger where we can have that kind of assurance that it's in the right place. But then you mentioned education, Dan, as well. I can imagine a similar kind of question being asked of Johannes Gutenberg when he developed the printing press. What's the need for it? Or take out the word financial, but there's just pure and simple a literacy gap. Are people going to have the need for these? What are you producing? Books? You mean to say that everyone's going to have books in their home and they're going to be able to read? And so I think it's not a million miles away. It's a technology which disrupts the current status quo. Arguably, I would say for the better, and can be leveraged for the gospel. So, the Gutenberg press, first thing that rolls off it is the Bible. And that's a very self-conscious thing. They set out to do it like that. And then obviously we get the flow of information from that. The book becomes the books. So I would say, it seems that the gospel is advanced in God's plan through certain technological revolutions of whichever day it happens to be in. I don't think it's a mistake that Christ came when he did, when the Roman Empire was the network it was with the roads it had. I don't think that the Reformation happened at the time that it did, when the printing press began. I don't think the internet has come about when it has, for accidental purposes. And I think that there are real practical applications for people in the mission field, for example, with Bitcoin, or churches needing uncensorable transactions in certain places of the world, or unconfiscatable value in other places where there might be difficulties abroad.
But what, again, I'm going to be pernickety here, but I can just think of a scenario. So it's interesting you said about the sort of missionaries and things like that, and it seems like your argument has been that we're not thinking short term, we're thinking long term.
Yeah.
But obviously, the thing with money is that we use fiat, currency, is it's viable for both. You can use it, if you've got cash in the hand, you can use it immediately. And it's worth what it is as you receive it, or close to it, or you can save it for the future. But let's say you send a church in the Philippines 500 quid, and then suddenly the next day Bitcoin drops 15%. Then they've now got less than they had. So it's hard to. So it's not like I get what you're saying. It's hard to see how a system in which still allows such fluctuations, and I think the beginning of 2022 is a good example of that.
Yeah, for sure.
And it's a tough sell to say how that's better than cash in hand or standard currency.
I agree. I do agree. So the issue is that if you are trading in and out of it, in the idea that you're going to make or even kind of maintain the value that it has at the time that you receive it, or a day later, yes, there will be fluctuations in the exchange rate. And I say exchange rate on purpose. I don't mean price. I mean the exchange rate. So yes, that can be an issue. I think the thing with the Lightning Network, as Phil and I demonstrated, is that the monetary velocity, so that is the speed at which the money can move in the system, is so high that you can effectively go in and out of fiat and Bitcoin at the moment, pretty much instantaneously. So I think that's what we've done with this family in Rotterdam. I've said to them, look, you don't want to be trading it day to day. It's just a fruitless thing for you to do at the moment. But you can receive this, and you can just get it instantly. You can exchange it for euros and then buy what you need, pretty much instantly. Okay, so at that point, yes, you're actually using it in the situation you're in, and it has the value that you get sent, or near enough to. You're not going to experience a 50% swing in 3 seconds when you convert it to your local currency. Now, I suppose the question would be, why is it so volatile? Why does it have such massive swings? And I think there's a possibly twofold answer for that. Number one, this is an asset that has a very, very limited supply available. Okay, when you break it down, let's just assume that 5 billion people were to adopt it. Okay, that would mean that there is approximately 230,000 sats available for every man, woman, child who adopted it, of 21 million whole bitcoins. That currently goes for I don't know, about 100 quid maybe. Not really looked recently. So the limited supply means that big movements in price can happen if it is being bought and sold in large volume currently, which it is on exchanges. That's another reason to self-custody Bitcoin, because a Bitcoin that is not on an exchange is a Bitcoin that can't be bought and sold by people who might want to manipulate its exchange. Okay. The other thing is that this is a money that has properties of durability, fungibility, transferability that are better than any money that we've had before. And so the hardest money, i.e. the money that has the best properties, always wins out in history. So there's a reason that we go from barter to coinage. It's because the coinage has better monetary properties than the barter. And there's a reason that we go from, for example, silver to gold, because arguably gold has better monetary properties than silver. It all depends on, the time in history, the place you're at, the relative scarcities, etc. But the harder money always wins out. Now, my argument is that given that Bitcoin has better monetary properties and is harder, and given it's now leveraging the internet as the network to get that information out, the more people understand it, the more that they will begin to use it. And so over time, the harder money becomes the money that everyone uses. And then they look back and say, why did we ever do that? I can look back, I don't think I've ever bartered anything in my life, because it's just much more convenient for me to, receive cash from my employer and then spend it. And you can look back and say, well, why did people ever barter? I think there may be a time coming, could be within my lifetime, where we look back and say, why did we ever use fiat money? Because the harder money wins out. But in the course of that happening, of course, there will be fluctuations, because people value it differently. It is, in fact, the only free market that we've got, the only truly free market where there aren't, stops on trading. So if your stock market drops, 6-7% intraday, there are artificial stops on trading to prevent those fluctuations from taking their full extent.
So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
Just one thing. I mean, it just got me thinking. I'm sure I read something earlier that said, well, let me put it in context. So what's to stop someone like wealthy individuals just hoarding Bitcoin? So I know that we I could just go on, I can buy some Bitcoin now. Mm-hmm. I read somewhere that there was a study done in the US last year that basically said that the top 10,000 owners of Bitcoin own 1/3 of all Bitcoin. So, which kind of seems like, monopolization of Bitcoin in the same way.
Yeah.
Is that a problem? Is that a problem?
I don't think it is. I think I have read the same study. I've got a slight difficulty with their methodology, because what they've failed to take into account is that some of those addresses are exchanges, and so they are not technically individual owners. They will have, beneficiary owners who they give IOUs to, and it'll be a lot of, different people's value mashed up into one address. Again, another reason to, claim your own, to make sure it's not given out to anyone else. I think the other difficulty is that the heuristics that they use to determine whether an address is owned by an individual or not a little bit faulty. On the Bitcoin network, you can have a relatively good guess based on the distribution and the movement of certain things, whether it's owned by an individual or not, but it's certainly not very obvious. So I think they've kind of overblown it a little bit. But the other thing is, are we happy to say that there will be an uneven distribution of these 21 million coins? And I think the answer must be yes. The answer must be yes, because the point is that we're not communist as Christians. We don't believe that wealth redistribution is just. We don't believe that taking from people to give to others is necessarily the just and right thing to do. God loves a cheerful giver, and so if in his grace he is putting it into people's hearts and minds that what matters is things in the long term, and what matters is that I am holding certain value and essentially mutually assuring somebody else's value, that then turns my mind to those who have less. Absolutely does. And it turns my mind to, what can I do with this? In my lifetime, in the lifetime of my children, any descendants, to redress certain balances that have historically disadvantaged some, disadvantaged many actually, and many have been disadvantaged through fiat money, because it really does. You look into the entire history. I'm not going to go into it too much, but there's a whole history of colonialism, which still is effective today. So, for example, the French central bank forces certain African countries to use to place deposits in the French central bank. Right, it's a complete violation of their national sovereignty, and it's a complete violation of their people's sovereignty in their own value. Right.
Yeah.
It really is
messy, isn't it?
It's bad. But we look at this new system, and yes, those who have lots in the current system have an opportunity to acquire lots of this finite amount going forward. But the thing that actually really advantages someone is the early mover advantage. So it's not necessarily those who have the most, but it's those who adopt the earliest.
But how's that? I can still see that's still an intrinsic sort of unfairness, in the sense that, so if I look at someone who's incredibly wealthy in the current system, say you're Jeff Bezos, but he's got rich from the current system because he provides a service that people value and continue to value, whereas just through some accident of history that I happen to, a friend told me about Bitcoin in 2009 or 2010, and now I'm a Bitcoin millionaire. I don't see how that's any. I don't see how that's an improvement necessarily.
Because the point is that because there's a finite supply, it will reward the patient over the impatient, and it will reward the prudent over the imprudent. So your millionaire teenager who got in 2011 may well end up being very prudent with that, and they may well hold it and be patient and have a long time preference. But equally, they may be stupid. They may buy a Lambo and crash it and write it off and have to claim insurance. And ultimately, in a closed monetary system, well, there won't be any more. They have to go somewhere, and they will end up going to people who will patiently drip their value into it. So yeah, I mean, it's not. It is not completely equal, but I don't think any human system ever will be. The thing it is equitable, in that if people know about it and they decide to do the work to educate themselves about it, and they come to the conclusions that the vast majority of people I know have come to about it, having done the work. You know, I think there's nobody who's taken 20 hours to understand this who doesn't have a positive view of it. If people do the work, then they are very likely to begin adopting it.
I would be interested in the 20 hours one. I'd love to see if there's any stats on that.
I might run a poll.
Yeah, how many hours have you done? See if you can get the ones that are negative on Twitter to interact with it.
Yeah, please do. Hit me up.
I think just in the sort of final moments, because we are reaching an hour and a half, we haven't talked huge. We've sort of brushed on things like the ethics of it and remittances and how it might help. I think at the moment the volatility is a fairly major impact on sending to missionaries, I think, for their usage straight away. But I think it can help build the support base for longer term mission. And so in terms of trying to work through the time preference, but even saying that, the people we supported, they were able to put it into use pretty quickly at the value that they received it at. So and then if you're in places like El Salvador where it's legal tender, it works. The prices, I imagine, of a cup of coffee aren't fluctuating with the price of Bitcoin. They're just
there won't be. No.
They're a few thousand sats, and that's it. That's what it always be. Well, not always necessarily, but like you get the idea. So I think in terms of its ethics in the sense of it's borderless, it's uncontrolled by governments. China tried to ban it. That it's recovered from that ban. Most of the mining ended up in Kazakhstan. You can find out about that on like the BBC website and things like that. What we haven't really touched on, I guess, which may be too big for the few minutes that we have, is that the fact that the energy is increasing. And I don't know, can you... I've got a couple quick answers regarding environment and Bitcoin and mining.
Cool.
But do you have a quick summary or resource because one of the major things against Bitcoin that people have, and it seems to be pushed out there quite a lot by those opposed to it, is that it's environmentally unfriendly, and therefore we should go to like proof of stake rather than proof of work or some other cryptocurrency that's less energy intensive. What are your thoughts on that?
Again, I'll break it down fairly quickly. So proof of stake over proof of work essentially rehashes the issues with the current fiat system in which a few who have make the rules for those who don't have, and with all the issues that attend to that.
So it's something to do with the staking so where Bitcoin miners, the proof of work verifies the transactions and the monetary policy.
To the point of, if you've reserved a 70% pre-mine and you're on a proof of stake where you have to have a consensus for changes to the network protocol, then nobody who ever owns your token who isn't part of that inner circle will ever get to make a decision that makes any difference.
Right. So is that pre-mine sets who sets the policy.
Exactly.
And those people can...
Yeah, so it's either you or your mates can do it, and then everyone else who just has pumped your bags can, get lost because they don't have a majority stake.
Right.
The issue of environmental impact, I think absolutely we need to be stewarding our planet well. It's part of the dominion mandate given us by God in the garden. God is concerned about his creation. I would say look at look at all of the energy, every part of it that the current system uses, from G4S men taking coins into banks to running a bank branch, tens of thousands of them across the world, to the energy that it takes to secure the value of a country in warfare, and then compare that to the 0.015% of the world's energy that the Bitcoin network uses. And I think you can make a comparison between the two. And then a resource, if people want to look into this further, thismachinegreens.com.
This or dis?
This, THIS. Thismachinegreens.com.
Machinegreens.com. I'll put that in the description. So there's basically a movie about it. And just on that note, some things that I found really interesting in this is that there's almost an incentivization, if that's a word. It incentivizes greener energy in many ways. So there's several places where I think it was Southern Africa. I might have got that wrong. It might have been South America. Either way, there's a place where conservation is too expensive to do it well.
Yeah.
But they have it's around a fairly significant waterfall where they can use the power of the waterfall to power their facilities, but the excess power coming from the waterfall can mine. And when there's too much load on the grid, they turn the mines off. But when there's excess load, that powers the mines, and it funds conservation. And there's other aspects of that with I know there's several projects in the States that are doing that.
Absolutely,
and so there's this incentive that the excess energy that power stations and places are creating, it can fund itself and compensate for the negative, the wastage of energy.
Sure, yeah. So it soaks up wasted energy, because you can essentially turn any energy source into magic internet money. It actually it disincentivizes waste, but also you can tap stranded energy resources and then make living somewhere, for example a remote waterfall, actually economically viable. So the amount of land that we use to live on this planet is not very much. And I think a lot of the people who would say that Bitcoin's boiling the oceans, it's destroying the planet, would also say we're overpopulating the planet. There's far too many people, and I think that's nonsense. There's not enough people. The more people there are, the more glorified God is. And we do have land and resources for people to live and live well. And those kind of tendrils of civilization will be reaching out to the areas where we've not lived before and creating community there. So I would say that
hopefully doing that well.
The future's bright and the future's orange.
The future's bright and the future's orange. I like that. Cool. So we've hit the hour and a half mark, and it does feel like it's been quite technical. So it almost feels like we need a second chat to really discuss how, because you've hinted at it, that there's some aspects of Bitcoin in its verification, in its decentralization, that echo Christian principles of what sound money might look like, but a bit more than that. And you kind of connected it to the printing press and things like that. And almost putting the power back in the hands of the everyday man. And I don't know if I'll be interested in discussing, is that Christian, putting decentralized power and Christianity are quite an interesting conversation, and I think Bitcoin does. Enable a bit of that
very short thing on that, and I would love another conversation about that. Absolutely. Very short comment. I happen to think that the Reformation was a very good thing, and I'll leave it cryptically at
that. Something about power and taking out of churches, I imagine. It's been a pleasure talking to you, Christian. So, Dan, do you have, before we go on to our usual last question of the evening, is there anything that would like wrap things up that you have to say? Like help us.
No, I think you're right. It has been. Well, first of all, I think I should apologise to you, Phil, because before we started, I said that I would sit back and not say anything, but
It's fine.
dominated.
It's been very, very
I
welcome, Dan.
didn't believe you, Dan.
I can't help. I
I'm
can't
still
help
yet to see you
myself.
silent in this.
I can't help myself. No, I think it has been technical, and I think there's, but also very clear and persuasive and helpful. But I do think we would benefit, because I really want to get into the nitty gritty of Christianity and some of the things you mentioned, in history, the Reformation and Genesis, and how this all connects to Bitcoin and perhaps cryptocurrency more generally. But I think that would make a really good separate discussion rather than to getting into it now.
Yes.
I think that I think for people listening, that would be very helpful as well, because you can kind of listen to this bit, which is more setting the ground, and then another chat to really get into just focusing on that aspect, and we can tell people to listen to the first bit
definitely
to get their head around things. I mean, other things, I mean, we usually do ask at the end in terms of sort of resources and things, but yeah, I mean, you've mentioned the machine is green, so I said I consider myself a novice, so yeah, I'd love to find out more in terms of resources you have. And is there anything sort of any books or resources about Christianity and Bitcoin would be interesting?
Yeah, there's a fair few out there. So I suppose if people are podcast inclined, there is a fantastic one called Bitcoin and the Bible podcast. 3 chaps who really do a deep dive, and certainly deeper than we could probably ever go on a thing like this. So Bitcoin and the Bible podcast, if you're really interested in the intersection of Bitcoin and Christianity. A book, if I were to recommend a single one, it's, I would say, probably not as in-depth on the Bible as it could or should be, but is a good kind of introduction, is a book called Thank God for Bitcoin.
Who's that by? Is that
it's a group of various authors.
Is it? Okay.
It was a collaboration project.
Right. Yeah, I think I heard that mentioned on another one. So I got one of I saw people recommending this, and I got it for Christmas. Was the Bitcoin Standard for those on the podcast, and as what I've been fascinated in all this in figuring it all out is there's an awful lot to try and figure out and get your head around in terms of what to avoid and what not to. But I've not been in an environment where money is talked about as much. And I think one of the concerns Dan raised, which we haven't, and again we should talk about, is how it can easily become an obsession.
Yes.
And it can become a form of idolatry, just like when it's all about price action and am I making money, it can very quickly become that.
Yes.
But this is also about like the impact of it on our economy, on our attitude toward debt, our attitude towards saving, how saving can actually benefit the community. You tend to be more generous. There's all sorts of things that what you were hinting at with the sort of high time reference stuff is just stuff that I've never really processed or heard processed, or like, because
the interesting point that Saifedean makes is that Bitcoin is that money is effectively the base technology of how civilization grows. How trade is done, and it's how ultimately trade effectively is the way that we relate to one another in this world. I suppose money is a very important thing. And Jesus Christ himself talked about money a lot, didn't he?
Well, yeah, so much about it.
Where you put your trust, where you put your faith.
God has a lot to say about dishonest scales and how we
100%,
manipulate things. I've just been reading Micah, and that's sort of coming into mind. And that if we have people in power who are able to tip the scales in their favor, and that's we have to figure out a way of navigating that. And while yes, there might be the X% that own a majority of Bitcoin, there is something about it that you even put your £10 in that will be worth more in 10 years' time than it was when you first put it in. And that little bit of saving going beyond the now and the here and now is actually really important. I just want to acknowledge one of the comments in the chat from Claire. That's interesting, not convinced. Seems to be that yet again the poor will still be poor. And I think there's an element of Jesus in that there will always be with us. But I think there's also an element of, if we find a money that can't be devalued to continue or make worse the society that the poor find themselves in, then perhaps it's something worth investing in, both in terms of our time and education, but also our church value and things like that. So I think, Claire, you've hit on something that could be another chat as well.
Well, that's part of my concern as well, as I sort of noted a bit earlier about how that's my concern. It's obvious to me how Bitcoin can benefit me, but less obvious how it benefits others. And I think the issue with the digital literacy is that, again, it's those it's much more less likely that those who would get the most maximum benefit from it are probably the least likely to have access to it, and that's not it's not something I'm totally convinced of. Yeah, not to say that I can't be, but it's something I'm sort of base level sort of skepticism.
I suppose the one thing I would say to that is that those who have benefited the most from the existing system have the least interest in moving away from it. So those to whom the asset prices are inflated by this constant supply of money, will just see this as it's just a weird technology like plaything, or that's for strange people. Those who are living hand to mouth and realize that they need somewhere to store their value that will grow instead of shrink, are absolutely incentivized to look into it early, and therefore will reap the benefits.
No, I do agree with that. I do agree. It's certainly an incentive for people in the current system to. That's why it's interesting. Me and Phil often talk about the press. Like, it's really interesting looking at the media, the media's presentation of Bitcoin is just overtly negative, overtly negative. Like, and it's absolutely not neutral. It's really hard to be educated about Bitcoin from the mainstream media. Someone who consumes it, but even because I know a little bit about it, I'm able to sort of be a little bit more sort of skeptical about what I'm reading. But it's so negative, and so
especially when it's down, especially when it's down.
But that's the time to buy it.
Very quiet, very quiet this week. But I haven't seen anything really in the Guardian this week about Bitcoin. And but the last month, it's been every day.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's to say, we're starting another conversation already, guys.
Yeah,
it's been good. It's been really helpful to just get the groundwork. And Christian, thank you so much for your time.
A genuine pleasure.
We'll definitely do it again, where we can have a bit more of what we're doing now with this bit of, we've figured out the technicals. Let's get into some of what it looks like. I put in the comments, and I'm sure you'd agree, Christian, that some of the stuff from El Salvador has been quite interesting, because it seems to have started a little bit from Bitcoin Beach, a use case for Bitcoin, setting up a microeconomy,
which started off as a Christian mission.
So I've put a link into the chat for that, because it's really interesting where these are people that don't have access to bank accounts, but they do have access to mobile technology, and that's quite a lot of the developing world where that's the case. So any sort of final comments, Christian, before I close up?
Hold Bitcoin, but hold Jesus closer.
Amen. I like that. Cool. Right, I'll just zoom back into. So there's not a huge amount planned for the next couple of weeks. Dan and I need to do some work, and we've got potentially Bob of Speaker's Corner back helping us with a bit around Islam, how to navigate interactions with Muslims well, while also being both wise and educated on things like the Trinity and the common interactions with Muslims that Christians will face. Aside from that, we've got a long list of people we need to reach out to, but we've been a bit on the back foot in terms of business. But we'll make sure we're back soon, and please do subscribe, and let us know what you think. Thanks, Claire, for watching. Thanks for those of you on the podcast, those of you that support us. We greatly appreciate it. And once again, thanks, Christian, and we'll see you both soon.
Cheers, no man.
Cool. Take care. God bless.